Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus, a new series I'm starting every week where we'll take a look at the affixes in the dungeons and help prepare you for This Week in Mythic Plus. So this episode is for the 26th of November, the week starting on Tuesday, 26th November for North American realms, or the 27th if you're over in EU. The affixes are Bursting, Volcanic, Fortified, and the Beguiling pattern is Enchanted Heavy. Now we're going to take a look at each dungeon, but before I get started with the dungeon by dungeon overview, let's just do some basic things about this week. This is the best week on the calendar for pushing high keys. That's because Bursting is generally a pretty favorable affix in high keys. It's harder in the lower keys, like in the 10s and the 15s, because it doesn't scale with keystone level at all. So the faster you're doing the dungeon, the more damage it does. And because the DPS doesn't scale up as you get to higher keys, and it's actually a little bit easier to stagger the bursting stacks and not have them all be going off at once. It's actually an affix that is easier, I'd say, to deal with in high keys than in low keys in many ways. Volcanic is pretty much a non-affix. There are a few boss fights where you'll notice it, but outside of those, it's generally pretty easy to avoid taking too much damage from, and is definitely the easiest affix on its row. Fortified is better for most dungeons this patch than Tyrannical. And the Enchanted Emissary pattern is the best by far for most dungeons. There are only a couple where one of the other patterns is more favorable to do. So with all those things put together, this is going to be the week where you'll see the highest scores in most dungeons. Most of the best dungeon runs of this season will be completed this week that this video is being recorded for. So this is the week to push keys. Unfortunately, it does overlap with a holiday in the North American regions. The American Thanksgiving is right now, so that may or may not help you have more or less free time, depending on what exactly your situation is. But anyways, let's get started off by taking a look at Ataldazar. If you're interested in where any of these actual routes come from, these are my weekly routes from Radar.io, so you can always go and download these for yourself. This is my expert route for each dungeon that you'll be seeing on screen here. And you can also find my basic routes over at Radar.io every week. These are always updated. I go through and make sure that they are still accurate and that they'll work for the dungeon, although sometimes I do make little oopsies and suggest pulls that are not actually realistic. So let's talk a little bit about what Ataldazar is like this week. The Enchanted pattern is phenomenal for Ataldazar because it's the one pattern where you really don't have to deal with obnoxious void-touched emissaries everywhere, and it's the one pattern where you can actually pull this 2-pack over on the left and there's not a Tides emissary in either pack. So with those things put together, you actually only need to pull one void this week. You only need to pull this void. You can pull this one also, and it's in my route, but a lot of people choose to skip this instead and skip this one also. So this is a great week for Ataldazar routes. None of the affixes are too bad. Fortified is a pretty good one here. You might have some trouble with, bursting stacks at the end of Sordid pulls. That's much of what might be a problem for you this week. And this one Void Emissary here can be a little bit of a pain because you're, fighting it with swords at the same time, so that can be problematic. This patrolling middle pack does not patrol this week. It just hangs out with the Enchanted Emissary over here, so you're going to need to skip it. But it's pretty easy to do that. You can skip it with, just the tank pulling them off to the side and then running through later. Or you can actually choose to pull this pack. It's not a bad week to fight these guys either. So, it is a fortified week. You might not want to. It's a little dangerous, but you can definitely get away with a lot of different strategies in Ataldazar this week. And there's nothing that stops you from doing this skip this week. There's no Void Emissaries that stop you from skipping into or out of the Volcal room, which is a really good thing as well. All in all, fantastic week for Ataldazar. All right, let's take a look at Freehold. This is by far the best Freehold week on the calendar, and it's not particularly close. So let me go through some of the reasons why this is the best Freehold week. It's Fortified week, so the hard bosses are not going to hit all that hard. The first boss isn't going to be too lethal like it is on Tyrannical weeks, and Eudora is a friendly captain this week. This week, Eudora is on your side, so you're not going to have a very hard time fighting the Council of Captains boss, and you don't have to pull a single Void-touched emissary this week. There's one Void-touched emissary in this pull near the start of the dungeon, so you can just shroud around this way instead and not fight it that way. As long as you have a way to, a shroud, that's easy to skip this Void-touched emissary this week. Or you can pull it and fight it here, but that's kind of annoying because then this patrol will come into you. So it's a really good week. I'd say if you don't have a shroud, you should probably still just death skip this thing into the boss room. And then, just easy emissaries all throughout. Affixes are fantastic for this week. Bursting, not a huge problem pretty much anywhere here. You might, run into some stacks when you're killing the neutrals, but the nice thing about these neutrals is they kind of stagger their own bursting for you because the shipmates and the deckhands have such different amounts of health that they're unlikely to actually roll bursting stacks. So all things considered, the best week on the calendar by far for Freehold, and you will see the highest Freehold run done this week for sure. King's Rest is one of the few dungeons where I'd say the enchanted pattern is not actually the best pattern as far as Beguiling goes, especially for groups that don't have access to like Shadow Meld. You get this Void Touched Emissary right here, which my friend Yoda calls the Loktar Ogar Void Emissary because Horde groups have to fight it, whereas Alliance groups can just Shadow Meld it just by itself, so that eats up some of your time fighting this stupid Void Touched Emissary. And there's another annoying Void Touched Emissary over here. One little tip about this Void Touched Emissary is that you don't actually have to pull it with these mobs. If you pull this Raptor in this pack, you don't actually get the Void Touched Emissary, so you can save it for later and you can deal with these 3 first. I'd recommend doing that. My expert route this week actually wants to do just a big skip across this whole bridge. So you just would do a death skip after you killed all this stuff and avoid fighting this void by doing that. That's one thing you can do as well. One thing to note as well about my expert route that you'll see here is that I'm arguing to pull Shadow Zool. However, you don't actually have to pull Shadow Zool if you have a Demon Hunter in your group or a really skilled Druid or Hunter. Because you can actually skip this mob using a little parkour trick. They might fix this. This could be fixed at any time, but you can check out my previous video on how to skip Shadow Azul. It's a little exploity, but it does make this a lot easier, and I guarantee you that the best runs of this dungeon will be using that strategy this week and not fighting Shadow Azul, unless they fix this by then, of course. Outside of that, pretty good week for King's Rest. Bursting with the Minions Azul is something to watch out for. If you're interested in using a strategy that involves killing these Minions Azul as they spawn over in this part of the room, you'll want the rest of your group to be right back up against the edge of the gong, and then they won't get bursting stacks, which is really nice. So that's something you can do, like a rogue, especially a Blood Elf rogue, has a very easy time doing that. And these ones also, you might want the rest of your group to hang back up here at the top of the stairs while you get rid of all these Minions Azul for the same reasons. All right, Shrine of the Storm. There's a lot of different ways to attack Shrine of the Storm this week. Many groups have different strategies, a lot of which will work well. One thing that you might see some groups doing, some high groups for instance, is pulling like this Living Current and line of sighting it around the side of these stairs here. That's an option this week that'll let you skip some more stuff later. Almost everybody is going to be skipping most of this nonsense here by doing a death skip of some kind or a Shadow Meld skip if you're Alliance. But all in all, a great week for Shrine of the Storm as well. It's worth noting that Tidesage Initiates do burst when they die, so that's why I'm not arguing to pull these 8 ones here. I'd rather just not deal with the bursting stacks. But the droplets and the eels that you'll find later in the dungeon do not burst when they die, nor do Abyss Dwellers. So only the Tidesage Initiates, which you'll find at the start of the dungeon and over here, are an annoying bursting threat. One cool tip this week against the Lord Stormsong fight is that Volcanic is a good way to break yourself out of the Ancient Mindbender ability. So that's something that you can use if you get targeted and mind controlled. Just stand in a volcano to break yourself out, rather than eating up a bunch of balls or jumping in the jacuzzi, because that is a little unreliable. That's a strategy that many people are not super familiar with and often causes deaths when people who don't know what they're doing try to do that. Okay, Siege of Borealis, another dungeon where the enchanted pattern is extremely favorable compared to the other patterns. You're going to have to fight this one void in the gateway up here, and then you can even skip this void here. And outside of that, there's no void along the path this way. This is the only week where there's no void in this area, the Bildrak corridor of Borealis here. And that's a really nice thing. That opens up a lot of different strategies this week. However, this is not one of the weeks where you can buff up a spotter with like bolstering or raging or anything like that active. So the very, very, very best groups might not have their best times in Siege this week, but might instead have it on a week where, say, raging or bolstering is active. For almost everybody else, this is going to be a really good Siege of Borealis week. You do need to watch out for bursting on some of these pulls. You'll get pretty heavy amounts of bursting stacks, and if you are using the spotter to kill things, sometimes that can cause the bursting stacks to like extend with only a second left and go up to a really high number, and that can be problematic for your healer. But outside of those cases, it's a really safe week to do most of this dungeon, and the boss fights being Fortified versus Tyrannical is really great in this dungeon in particular also. Okay, let's talk about Temple. This is by far the best week on the calendar for Temple of Cithralis. You basically have to deal with 0 Void-touched emissaries, and the bosses are Fortified, not Tyrannical, so that's a lot easier to do. You can skip this little Void-touched emissary here. If you're whoever's grabbing this orb can just sneak around the side this way and not ever get in combat with this Void-touched emissary. And there's not really any rough pulls this week at all. These static charge dervishes might pose a threat to you. And maybe this Maraktha room will also be hard for you, but realistically, the timer in Temple this week is so forgiving. that you can really, like, you can take this room slowly and be totally fine. There's basically, like, the boss fights are so quick, and there's really no difficult parts of the dungeon. So even though it's fortified, I'd say the hardest part is probably still killing Galv in a high key. That's likely to be one of the bigger tests, maybe the first boss also. And none of the trash pulls are very threatening. There are no emissaries that will cause you very much trouble at all this week. All right, let's move on to the Mother Lode. Historically, the Mother Lode is one of the best dungeons on Tyrannical relative to Fortified weeks. Fortified weeks are often harder because the trash is pretty rough. There's a lot of abilities that'll like randomly one-shot people in your group, such as the charges from the Addled Thugs, the clotheslines, and the grease guns from the mech jockeys. You might not notice these if you're doing low keys, but in high keys, this effect is just murders random people in your group all the time, and that's much worse on Fortified. Also, throw rock from the mine rats, earth shock from the earth shapers up here, all kinds of trash, pretty nasty in here. Whereas the bosses are fairly tame, except for if you're bad at dealing with magic damage, the last two can really mess up your tank. One strategy that tanks like to do on weeks, even fortified weeks, but especially on tyrannical weeks, is after killing Azarok, they'll hearth out and then run right back in, and the graveyard will have updated to right here. So they'll hearth out and they'll put on like Null Barrier, Major even, or Azeroth's Undying Gift Major or something, and they'll switch their talents. So like Prot Warriors will change from Bolster to Never Surrender, those sorts of changes. Paladins might change from Blessed Hammer to Holy Shield. All sorts of things to make them more effective against magic damage at the end of the dungeon. Some tanks don't want to bother with that, but one of the nice things is that you can usually set your Hearthstone to be pretty close to this dungeon and hearth right after Azarok, and other DPS in your group can also hearth and switch to a single target DPS setup, because usually after Azarok, you end up skipping all the way to Rixa and skipping most, if not all the way, to Mogul Razdunk, and so you don't have to do very much trash for the rest of the dungeon. So that strat really helps a group be well equipped to deal with these last two bosses. Not as necessary on fortified weeks like this one. This week in general, a great week for the Mother Lode. As far as fortified weeks go, it's probably the best fortified week on the calendar for the Mother Lode, and it might even be better than the tyrannical weeks because it's just such a good week. Like Enchanted, Bursting, Volcanic are all such great affixes to be dealing with compared to the other options on their rows. And there are really no bad emissaries here. You'll see, for instance, my expert rat has pulling this Void Touched emissary here because that's something that it's kind of hard to skip and it opens up a lot of extra space. But if you're in a really honed group, you can actually just not pull this Void Touched emissary at all, and you can do this dungeon fighting 0 voids. And that can be a really effective strategy in those super high key groups where Void Touched emissaries start to really outscale the other emissaries in terms of how much of a pain they are to deal with. One thing to note, if you do choose to fight this Void Touched emissary, is that there's not actually line of sight here. Like if you get behind this little pillar here back into the first boss room, it looks like you're out of line of sight of this thing, but you're not. So you might still get hit by it in a weird spot. So be ready for that if you're fighting it. Okay, let's move on to the Underrod. The Underrod is a dungeon that I'd describe as one of the best dungeons on bad weeks. Most of the weeks where there are problematic emissaries or affix combos, the Underrod is a fairly good dungeon. This is a good week, and the Underrod is also good on this good week. None of these affixes too rough here. Fortified means that the biggest problem is likely to be Feral Bloodswarmer pulls in Kragmaw's room. Those are pretty hard-hitting enemies. But outside of that, there's not really anything that should pose too much of a threat in this dungeon. It's just figuring out a way to pull this room quickly enough that you're going to beat the timer, but also safely enough that nobody's going to get murdered by the Feral Bloodswarmers. One thing worth noting is that there are a lot of cases in this dungeon where emissaries are not actually linked to the pack that they're next to. Like this Emissary of the Tides here, you can avoid pulling it by pulling the Reanimated Guardian with like a single target ability that is closest to your group. This Emissary of the Tides won't even pull, and then you can avoid fighting it until you're done dealing with this Death Speaker, for instance, and then pull into the Emissary of the Tides. That sort of tactic is really useful in a lot of spots in this dungeon, although not too many this week in particular. Also worth noting this week, this is the only the only Beguiling pattern where you don't have to deal with the Tides next to these two Defilers. So if you're used to that being a really pain point for your group, this week is the week where you don't have to deal with that. And that's really, really welcome because that is a really awful combination of mobs to have next to a Tides Emissary. And this is the week where you don't have to deal with that. So again, great week for Underrot. I expect to see the best Underrot runs of the season done this week. It's worth mentioning that the Underrot is one of the few dungeons where Volcanic is a really big pain. On the Unbound Abomination fight, you will start spawning a million volcanoes after the first 30 seconds or a minute or so because there are so many spores active that volcanoes are spawning based off of. So you'll need to have a plan for dealing with that. It's actually this is one of the hardest weeks to fight the Unbound Abomination. Volcanic is really only a real affix on this boss fight. This is the only boss fight where it's actually really hard. Honestly, it's a little too hard, I'd say, on the Unbound Abomination if the fight goes long. Luckily, the fight is unlikely to go too long because it is Fortified Week instead of Tyrannical Week. Okay, let's talk about Tol Dagor. Tol Dagor is also a dungeon that's good this week. There are some problematic points this week. Mainly Overseer Korgus with Volcanic is one of the few boss fights where Volcanic is actually a real affix, because explosive bursts can like knock you back into it, and Heartstopper Venoms can cause pain if you're trying to move to avoid taking damage from Volcanic. So that is something to watch out for. Overseer Korgus likely to be the hardest part of this dungeon. Volcanic can also be a bit of a pain in the cannon segment, and also while you're fighting Jess Howlis, you can get volcanoes spawning under you. Okay, when he stuns you to go into the smoke powder stun, going into the second phase, make sure that you're not like all clumped up, because you might get a couple volcanoes spawning under everybody and murder the whole group. That's something that I've seen that happen once, and don't let that happen to you, because that's a really embarrassing way to throw this key this week. Outside of that, not very many bad emissaries. A good combination of stuff this week. Wow, I need to update my Tol Dagor route. They changed the emissary coding in MDT, so like all kinds of random emissaries are tagged, and you can see all the colors are a little offset, so I need to fix that. But if you actually go to Raider.io and you check out my weekly route this week, don't worry, the Tol Dagor route will be fixed, and it won't have all these weird emissaries marked in different colors. Anyways, let's move on. Waycrest Manor. All right, this is another good dungeon for this week, another dungeon where I expect the best runs to be done this week. Volcanic is a little bit of a pain on some of the boss fights. Heartsbane Triad, Lord and Lady Waycrest, you can actually like be in spots where it's really annoying to have volcanoes spawning under you there. And if you get Soul Thorns on Soulbound Goliath and you don't get broken out fast, you could die to volcanoes there, although that usually means that things are going wrong beyond that. Bursting, not too bad in here. Ever since they made maggots not trigger these on-death affixes, bursting has not been something I have found to be too problematic in Waycrest, with the exception of, like, if you're pulling all these dogs, you might die to bursting, so watch out for that. You might get 11 stacks here when you kill all of these, so that can be a pain. But really, Waycrest, nothing too rough this week. Worth noting that as far as the cellar goes, there is a Void-Touched Emissary on the right-hand side of the cellar this week, so if you're coming down from the kitchen side, you will have to deal with a Void. And if you're interested in shrouding the cellar, you're going to want to come through the cellar on the left-hand side instead. I hope you've enjoyed this video, This Week in Keys. I hope you enjoyed the little rundown of what each dungeon is going to be like. Let me know what you think of this type of video, and if you like it, I can keep doing it every week, or if you thought it sucked, I'll stop wasting my time on it and start making other videos instead. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you liked the content, and I'll make more of it, and you can get notified. Click the notifications button. I'm supposed to tell you that also. And check out my stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos, where I stream a lot of World of Warcraft. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.